This presentation covers the growth and decline of the major religious movements in the 20th century and projects to the future likely developments if the present trends continue. These projections are less susceptible to unexpected change than some of the other demographic upheavals that were discussed in Chapter 1 of the Johnston text. Religion will prove to be as important to the 21st century as political ideologies were for the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's important to discern developments in religions at the present time to be able to understand likely outcomes over the course of the next 40 years. We start by looking at the past, present, and then the future of the main 6 religious streams, and then project towards where things will go from there. And then in this presentation, we look briefly at each of those 6 streams to explore them in depth. Understanding really the development of developing patterns in the world, major religions, is of fundamental importance for the 21st century. Contrary to communist expectations, the world's religions are not about to wither away. It's astonishing that it was in fact the communist ideology which withered away. This was all in spite of the hideous cruelty and persecution with which they sought to help this natural process to be accomplished through their own agendas of persecution and slaughter, which were explored earlier in this course. So modern Western secularists and humanists also desire to marginalize religion, especially Christianity, and even to mock Christians to silence their voice in society. But they will prove to be unsuccessful on a global scale, even if they are successful in Western societies. So in this study, the authors of our textbook classify non-religion in its secularist or atheist forms as a belief or another stream of religion. Atheism is not a limitation for a belief system to be called a religion, but for Buddhism in its original form, it's also atheistic, but its followers have down the road effectually deified the founder to almost the status, I guess, of a god. And much of that has happened with communism's founders and leaders as well. As we move through this presentation, I'd like to first of all briefly define the main religious streams and belief systems, and then we'll take a look at the past, really concentrating on the 20th century and its dramatic changes. Also, we'll focus on the present, drawing heavily on amassed data from the Operation World database, and then we'll see that this same data indicates future trends of rise and decline globally and continentally, and we'll explore those. David Barrett and Todd Johnson, in their massive 3-volume World Christian Encyclopedia, exhaustively classify the religions of the world. And here, what we're trying to do is sort through some of their findings and naming really over 10,000 distinct religions in the world, listing 270 religions and para-religions to really para-religions that number way over 500,000 even. And what Barrett and Johnson do is show us in their own table of 19 religions a way to break all of this down. So if you go from their volume into Operation World, they simplified it a bit. They've limited that down to 9 religions and a summary of some of the smaller religions that are grouped together. In this presentation, we're going to narrow that even a little bit further to 6 major streams. As previously mentioned, Operation World is the major database source for the graphics in this presentation, and the author has expanded and updated the 2001 data with more recent information from census, Cs, and such. We've also extrapolated that data to project what it'll be in 2050. So this database, in turn, was the primary source for the 2010 version of Operation World. So the above table in this slideshow shows the 2001 figures for those 9 large religious sects. So in the course textbook, Future of the Global Church, the author streamlined this, as previously mentioned, down into 6 categories or streams. And the 5 last categories above then are put together in this list under the term ethnic or other. And they did that for the following reasons. First of all, most are limited to an ethnic group or network and are not usually seeking converts from other religions. Secondly, some, such as Baha'i or Judaism, are global, but they have a really strong ethnic base. Thirdly, often the boundary between ethnic and religious religions is fairly diffuse. So, syncretic forms of Christianity or folk Islam are really all an amalgam of indigenous beliefs and elements of global religion. So, if we look at this next chart, we can see then the 6 major streams of religion identified in our textbook and throughout the rest of this presentation. The relative proportions of these 6 religious streams are shown in this pie chart. So each one of these 6 are covered separately in the pages that follow, the final one being that of Christianity. So this later then forms the platform for much more detailed elaboration of the Christian world, the church, and its ministry in the rest of our textbook. So a few observations here. First of all, the top 3 sectors, Muslim, non-religious, and Christians, are the only major streams that will gain significant numbers of new followers in the 20th century, or they're the only ones that will continue to expand moving ahead. The other 3 are likely to lose out significantly to those other belief systems. And thirdly, the paradox with the non-religious sector is that despite their numbers being significantly increased from all religions, and actually the majority coming from Christianity and ethnic religions, their percentage of the world's population will decline as it has done since the collapse of Euro communism in 1990. And this will be due to the ever-accelerating breakdown of family life, low family sizes, dysfunctionalities that are being generated and perpetuated. Now, the many who abandon faith and become non-religious will not make up for the losses in the population implosion that's now developing in secularized societies. So if we look at this next slide, we see the 6 major streams of religion. And Christianity has further been subdivided in this discussion into 6 branches, or 6 mega blocks. Those are shown in a later bar graph. Catholicism, first of all, once the universal church, but really after the split between the Eastern Church, the name Catholic was claimed by the Western Church under the leadership of the Pope. We also see another mega block as the Orthodox Church. We see the Protestant Church as a major mega block here. And a subdivision of that would actually be the Evangelical. Another mega block would be Anglicans, originally an English national breakaway from the Roman Catholic Church. And then we see the independent and indigenous churches of the world. We also look at the Muslim world as a major stream, and there are 3 broad divisions in the Muslim world, and mainly derived from early differences in who was to succeed Muhammad after his death. So we see, first of all, the Sunnis. They accept legitimacy of the 4 secular caliphs who came from Muhammad's tribe. And among Sunni who arose to a wide variety of teaching in schools of interpretation of their holy writings, So the Sunni have no single religious leader, and one of the more extreme teachings is that of Wahhabism, and that's in Saudi Arabia, which is a main source of modern jihadism and the sect to which Al-Qaeda is most closely aligned. We can also look at Shia. They claim that Ali, the cousin of Muhammad and father to Muhammad's only grandchildren, should be his successor. And so the Sunni actually defeated them in battle in 661. This resulted in Islam's first major and really permanent division between the two groups. And then we see some other smaller divisions in Islam, such as Ibadis, etc. If we move on to look at the Hindu stream, then anyone who practices a non-monotheistic religion in India is generally considered a Hindu. So the very name is a corruption of the Persian word for the Indus River. So Hindu came to be applied to any inhabitant of the Indian subcontinent. One interesting thing that has emerged, in addition to their philosophical system and a number of superstitions there, the caste system has created division within Hinduism, and in some ways actually defines it. So the layers of society are shown here in this diagram, the caste system, derived from the time of the arrival of the Aryans and has persisted since. So discrimination on the basis of caste is technically illegal in India, but socially it's widely practiced. It is the effects of globalization, political democracy, and education that's causing really that backward caste to increasingly protest at the exploitation and discrimination that's within Hinduism. It's likely to cause huge hemorrhaging of those people and their dispersion to other religions in the coming years. Moving on to the next stream, we can look at Buddhism, and there are three main branches. First of all, Theravada Buddhism is practiced mostly in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. It's often considered the purest form of Buddhism, and it's based on the oldest Buddhist texts. You can also speak of Mahayana Buddhism. That's practiced mostly in China, Korea, and Japan. And it emphasizes universal compassion and the selfless ideal of the Bodhisattvas. And then we can speak of the others, Lamaism and such. And then we can speak of these ethnic or other groups. And so all other religions are grouped together here under this general umbrella. And there are really four major types. There are traditional ethnic religions. These are usually unwritten and tribal or customary. They have customary tribal or customary beliefs within their individual cultures. It could include animism or spiritism, ancestor worship, voodoo, shamanism, these type of practices. We can also speak of literate ethnic religions. That would include Jainism in India, Sikhism, Taoism, Confucianism, even Shintoism in Japan, etc. Then we can speak of some of the world's smaller religions, such as Baha'i in the Middle East or Jews in Israel. And lastly, we can think about new religions. Earlier we mentioned that there were some 500,000 religions, and among these are some of the new religions of the world. So we can speak of Soka Gakkai in Japan or New Age in the West. And we shouldn't move on without mentioning the non-religious. And the secularization of the West, and in all countries really impacted by communism, has led to a large increase of non-religious people, atheists, and their numbers dropped significantly after the fall of Eurocommunism. But many in former countries remain secularists and materialists, and large numbers of Chinese in China itself, and even those who are part of the Chinese diaspora fall into this non-religious category. So we can see that all the 6 main religious streams are shown here. There are many levels of complexity, of course, which cannot be described in this brief presentation, but we can see that this is the state, really, of religion in the world today. So we've been thinking a bit about the rise and fall of empires and their associated religious systems. Now we want to take a look at recent developments in the religions of the world. And by recent, what we mean are the 2 centuries since the commencement, really, of the modern missions movement. The purpose here is to review the progress of the gospel since the 19th century. And this diagram has been slightly adapted from another book by Broomhall, and it's published in a book entitled The Evangelization of the World. So the animation here is pointing out, first of all, that the world population in 1887 was 1.3 billion. That was just about the population of the Americas alone in 2010, and only just over 20% of the total world population in 2010. We also see here that Protestants were almost entirely in Northern Europe and Northern America, even after a century of costly mission endeavor during this time. And we see that there were then estimated to be only about 3 million converts to Protestantism out of heathenism when we look back to 1887. We see that the Orthodox were confined to their traditional areas, and they really did not expand. Catholics were dominant in much of Europe, Latin America, and the Philippines, and Muslims were approaching really their lowest ebb of growth and influence at that time. The purpose of this graph here is to show that the fastest and most dynamic religious movements in the world today are not really, as many claim, Muslims, but they're actually Christian evangelicals and charismatics, including the Pentecostals. So the annual growth rate from 1990 to 2000 for the world is given here, and those with growth rate smaller than this are listed above, and those growing faster are listed then below this. So we see here that the world population growth is dropping fast, but the world's population is unlikely to reach a measure of stabilization actually for another 50 years. Religious movements that are growing more slowly. So Orthodox churches are in decline, Catholics are growing in certain areas of the world, Africa and Asia, but mostly declining in the West. We see that Buddhism is declining. We see that Hindus and ethnic religions, as well as Christians in general, are maintaining their status. And we see that there are some other religious movements that are growing. So Protestants in general are growing in the non-Western world, but declining in the West. We see Muslim growth, and a lot of this is through higher birth rates, but they have a number of conversions as well. And the surprising fact is that it is the trans-confessional Christian networks of charismatics and evangelicals that are the fastest growing religious movements today. And much of that is through conversions from within wider Christendom and other religions. So the major contest for the hearts and minds of humankind will be really between the evangelicals and the Christians as we look ahead, and the Muslims rather, as we look ahead. If we look at this map of the nations of the world shows the majority religions in 2000. To a great extent, the situation is still prevailing today. And so we see Christianity represented here, and Islam, non-religious, Buddhist, Hindu regions, and the ethnic or other regions. This area here is sometimes known as the 1040 window, and this is an important region of the world that has been targeted as the most unreached area of the world for missions to focus on over the last several years. If we look at this map, we see the majority religions by language, and so this map shows all the language of the world with a specific geographical homeland in 2000. And over the past 30 years, much research has been done to analyze the languages and peoples of the world. And the 15th edition of the Ethnologue listed 6,912 languages, but that actually becomes 11,000 language communities in the world's nation. And of those, about 7,000 are both indigenous and have some specific home area within their countries. So an overview of languages of the world are shown here, and they're colored according to the largest religious components among their speakers. So the line boundaries of these language polygons have been removed, and it gives far more detail about the spread of the six religious streams. And so we'll explore that and reflect on that moving ahead. Again, getting back to this idea of the 1040 window, we can think of this as a kind of resistant belt. And the purpose of this chart is to show that the major evangelistic challenge of the 21st century is that of seeing Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists come to Christ. And they are the major religious groups to be found in this area. So the number of nations with majorities in these three religions are shown here, together with their rounded populations below. So if we were to define the 1040 window, then it's that area of the world between latitudes of 10 degrees and 4 degrees north of the equator. It covers North Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And that window has in view most of the world's areas of greatest physical and spiritual need, and most of the world's least reached peoples and most of the governments that oppress Christianity reside within that region. So some wonder whether the church really has a future. And this is really a limiting ethnocentric or Western view of the world in light of the experience that we're having in our own countries. And one of the great surprises is the important role of religious belief in the coming decades and coming centuries. So it's one of the contentions here that non-religion is just as much really a belief system as the other religions. As we progress through the 21st century, there will be the unfolding contest between three major religious belief systems, between Christianity, Islam, and non-religion. And as we look at some of these graphs moving ahead, then we can see here an indication of the changing percentages of these six religious streams. And so with Christianity, we see that basically it's going to be it's projected to be somewhat unchanged over the next 50 years. Again, looking at Islam, we see steady growth largely due to the higher birth rate, but also some diversion. When we look at the non-religions of the world, we see that that is growing, and that is in part due to secular humanism and such. And then when we look at the remaining, we see that Hinduism, Buddhism, and the other ethnic religions are basically tending to stay the same in the case of Hinduism, but not really grow in any of the other cases. This is another representation of changes in, or projected changes in majority religion. So this better helps us see the changes in the world. So of the 6 major religious faith systems, 3 then are either declining or holding their state. It's only the proselytizing belief systems of Islam, Christianity, and we could say the non-religious group that is tending to grow. So confrontation then between them will actually determine probably the rest of human history. And during this period there is the massive change from ethnic religions to Christianity. No nation has moved from being Hindu or Buddhist to another religion, but there continues to be loss to Christianity, Islam, and the non-religious strains. So that's important to note here. And if we just look through a few more charts here, we can see the average annual growth here from 1900 to 2050 of the overall world population, and we see that that the world population exploded in the 60s and 70s and was at its height, and that is going to stabilize in the coming years. When we break down now some of the religious streams compared to this population growth, then we get to see why is it that things are growing, or why are these groups not growing. And so we can see here with the non-religious groups that the dramatically high growth rates in the 20th century were largely due to a kind of anti-religious stance and that atheistic influence of communism. The growth has resumed in the 21st century as others have turned their back on religion. When we look at Islam, we see here that the high growth rate of Islam is really consistent, moving ahead and projected to stay fairly consistent. And when we see Hinduism, we see the same thing, though a slight decline moving ahead. Looking at the ethnic religions, we see, in this case, large losses in the mid part of the 20th century, and that was largely due to tribal peoples all over the world who are turning to Christianity, and especially we can see that in Africa. When we look at Buddhism, again we see large losses in China, Mongolia, in North Korea, partially due to communism and the kind of anti-religious sentiment there in the 20th century. But we also see that the failure, really, of the Chinese cultural revolution started to create an openness to Christianity and growth of Christianity there as well. And when we move on to look at Christianity, we see that basically that growth rate is about the same. And where that growth does occur is mostly in the non-Western world. So here is a full picture of all 6 belief systems together. Note how the growth and decline rates are dramatic in the first half of this period, but as population growth slows, so do the religious growth rates tend to converge on the population growth rates. So we've lived through one of the most unusual religious change scenarios really ever seen on Earth. And if you realize what is happening around them. The next chart shows some of the losses and gains in these religious streams in the preceding years and moving ahead. Again, we see how dramatic this is represented in the 50s to 2000, but how those ranges start to close moving ahead. We see that essentially that overall growth rate is about 0. And here we show the anticipated growth rate for the first half of the 21st century averaged out over the whole 50 years. So I think this is helpful in giving a clearer summary of what lies before us. And the two pie diagrams represent the world population and the relative change in the proportions of belief systems over that period. So the pie shows the ratio between the two, which is represented by the radius, not the area. So the world population is likely to be half again as large in 2050 in comparison to what it was in 2000. So the area shown may give the impression of higher growth than is actually the case. The bar graph then shows the average growth rates over that period for each of these 6 belief systems. And this shows very clearly the difference between the growing and declining systems on a percentage basis. So only 2 religions will continue to grow, Islam and Christianity. And in other words, the major Abrahamic faiths will increase their proportion of the world's population. The Buddhists, Hindus, and ethnic religions will increase during this time. If we move on to this chart, we see differences in growth rates of populations and belief systems relative to regional populations in the major regions of the world. And the first row of pies gives the religious breakdown of each continent. And each continent is represented by the same size to allow comparison in growth rates in the second row. The second row shows the ratio of 2000 population to that of 2050 for the region, then followed by a pie based on radius, not area. And then the third row shows the average annual growth rates of the different belief systems relative to continental population growth rates. Some of these results are surprising. So, for example, in Africa, Muslims will not necessarily grow overall. Their gains and losses are basically going to balance out. Christianity, however, will continue to grow, but at a much smaller rate. Asia actually emerges as the most multi-faith continent, with both Muslims and Christians making gains. Europe will become increasingly multi-faith because of immigrants and higher birth rates. North America will see some of the same trends as Europe, but with a slower real decline in the Christian base. And the Pacific, with its Caucasian majority, will mirror Europe with large increases of non-Christian migrants into the area. So the growth of Muslims there will be the highest, but from a smaller original population base than Europe. So it's actually higher growth rate in that case. And I want to conclude with just some questions for the 21st century. 21st century is developing into what many perceive to be a political, sometimes even military confrontation between Islam, secularism, and Christianity. And yet Jesus promised, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." How can biblical Christians who are politically marginalized inherit the earth without resorting to worldly methods or weapons? Another burning question that we might throw out there is the majority of Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are likely to increase their representation of the global population from 47.9% in 1900 to 53.9% in 2000 to 61.6% in 2050. So what are the implications for us if we are to relate to non-Christians as both world citizens and as Great Commission?